Ireland. And northern Scotland will see some showers arrive by the end of the night as well. Those showers will be falling as sleet and snow over the hills, but rain at lower levels. Now into the start of Saturday, it's very similar to Friday. We'll see the brightest skies across central and southern Scotland, some sunshine into western parts of England as well as Wales, but an increased signal for some showers around some of these North Sea coasts, northern Scotland as well. And it's going to start to feel colder. Temperatures are beginning to fall away at this stage for Shetland in particular. That's where the cold air is coming from. Northerly winds starting to arrive later Saturday, and we'll likely see a few flakes of snow across Shetland as those northerly winds dig in. But the cold air sweeps nationwide on Sunday and into Monday. Chance of some snow in places mainly around coastal areas.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions are, those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like.
Absolutely.
On Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, The People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Hello, you're watching and listening to Andrew Pearce here on GB News. And with you until 2 o'clock, here's what's coming up. What a row about Sue Gray's appointment as Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. Sue Gray, of course, was the senior civil servant who did that report into Partygate, which effectively wrecked Boris Johnson's premiership. So was it an impartial report? And should her appointment be blocked? More leaked Matt Hancock WhatsApp messages suggesting his team asked if they could lock up Nigel Farage for breaking lockdown rules. I wonder how he'd have taken to that. Also, Ken Bruce, the radio presenter with the biggest audience anywhere in Britain, bowing out from the BBC today because, of course, he's too old at 72. Joining me for the next hour is going to be the Conservative peer, Lord Vasey. And you at home, of course, are such an important part of this show. Email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk. That's what's coming up this hour and more. But first, the latest news.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 12. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg is calling for a proper inquiry into Sue Gray's appointment as Sir Keir Starmer's new Chief of Staff. The senior civil servant led an independent investigation into Partygate, but it was announced yesterday that she was leaving the civil service to join the Labour Party. Allies of Boris Johnson have condemned her new role, with the Tory party chair calling it inappropriate. Mr Rees-Mogg says the appointment invalidates her report into lockdown breaches at Number 10.
Former MP accepted her two reports on the strict understanding that she was impartial, and that now looks wrong. No confidence can be placed in the evidence she secured or passed to the police. So instead, there should be an investigation into her and to her appointment. We should have an inquiry into what she has done and her contacts with Labour whilst she's been a civil servant, particularly those with the office of the Leader of the Opposition.
Further leaked WhatsApp messages by Matt Hancock suggest his team asked if they could lock up Nigel Farage for being a pub hooligan and breaking lockdown rules. The messages revealed by The Telegraph were allegedly sent in 2020 after Mr Farage shared a video of himself drinking at a pub. A fortnight earlier, he was at a Trump rally in the US. Under COVID lockdown rules, anyone coming to England from abroad was required to quarantine for 14 days or face a £1,000 fine. At the time, Mr Farage said he wasn't breaking quarantine rules. However, he has since said he probably was.
When I was photographed that day the pub's open, had I reached the full 14 days? Well, it was a bit nip and tuck. I think probably I hadn't quite reached the time. I always made sure I used hand sanitizer. I always kept my distance from people. And I have to say, you know, bad laws make people lawbreakers.
Constance Martin and Mark Gordon will appear in court today after the remains of a baby were found in Brighton. The pair have been charged with gross negligence manslaughter, concealing the birth of a child and perverting the course of justice. The body of a newborn was found in an area of woodland in Hollingbury on Wednesday after a 2-day search. The couple, who were arrested on Monday, will appear at Crawley Magistrates Court. The HS2 project could be delayed in an attempt to curb rising costs. That's according to the project's chief executive. The line's supposed to provide a faster rail service between London and Manchester, but there are reports it may no longer run to its planned terminal at Euston as a cost-saving measure. The project's chief executive now says the impact of inflation means they're having to look at ways of reducing costs further, including the timing and phasing of the project. MP Neil Coyle has apologised in the House of Commons and said he's ashamed of his behaviour. That's after he was found to have breached Parliament's bullying and harassment policy. The independent expert panel has recommended a 5-day suspension for the former Labour politician. It follows reports of foul-mouthed and drunken abuse of another MP's assistant. He's also accused of bullying and harassing a parliamentary journalist. Both instances took place in a Commons bar. A Nobel Peace Prize winner and pro-democracy activist has been sentenced in a Belarus court to 10 years in prison for funding protests. Alice Bialyatsky, whose human rights group provided legal and financial aid to protesters during a 2020 wave of unrest in Belarus, has also been convicted of tax evasion. He claims he's being persecuted for political reasons. Russian news agency TASS, reporting on the sentencing, says the verdict's likely to be strongly condemned by the West. And it may well be March, but a cold weather alert's being issued for parts of the UK at the start of next week. The UK Health Security Agency says freezing temperatures and wintry showers are forecast across England from Monday, bringing with it a risk of ice. The Met Office, meanwhile, has issued a snow warning for parts of Scotland and the northeast of England. The cold snap's expected to last until midnight on Wednesday. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back to Andrew.
You know, it's impossible to exaggerate the importance for good government of a scrupulously impartial civil service. So the credibility of senior civil servant Sue Gray's report into Partygate, which effectively wrecked Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister, rested on her supposed unimpeachable impartiality. We now know, just 8 months after her report dropped, she's not just an ardent Labour supporter, she's to be Chief of Staff, no less, to Labour leader Keir Starmer, destroying the civil service reputation for impartiality. The appointment can be blocked. I think it should be. I'm joined now by the Associate Editor of the Daily Telegraph and, of course, GB News' very own presenter, Camilla Tominey. Camilla, hello to you. I have to say, very rarely when we do our job in politics does my jaw drop. When I heard that Sue Gray had got this job with Keir Starmer, my jaw hit the floor.
It is quite extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, even if you think that the report wasn't a stitch-up of Boris Johnson, and in fact he himself said that he felt vindicated by the report, some say it could have gone a lot harder than it actually did. Even if you don't think that, you still might think that there's a degree of inappropriateness to somebody who's in that privileged civil service position, no doubt in the possession of a huge amount of sensitive information, then walking straight from that role to the leader of the opposition's office and acting as Sir Keir Starmer's right-hand woman. I mean, it just does smell decidedly iffy. Of course, there are questions to be asked about when she started negotiations with Keir Starmer over this job. If it was weeks or if not months ago, as The Times has reported today, then of course serious questions need to be asked about her impartiality with regard to the Partygate probe, if she was having an additional dialogue as to her career prospects with the Labour leader's office.
We pointed out in the Daily Mail today, Camilla, she blocked somebody from Number 10 going to the House of Lords for 12 months because she thought there had to be a decent space between the two jobs. She's breaking her own rules there because she wants to start with Keir Starmer right away.
I mean, I think the instantaneous nature of her resignation has also raised eyebrows, this idea that suddenly she's left this job. I mean, I think the first that the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, heard of it was when the news broke. I don't think he was given prior warning, which again suggests a degree of iffiness about the entire process. I mean, I think if you are in that robust civil service role and you're supported by people that keep on banging on about impartiality and nothing to see here, that there shouldn't be any fear of an investigation. The whole thing should be probed. I think the Cabinet Office are looking at it, and rightly so. I think anyone in the civil service who defends the civil service as being impartial won't have anything to worry about by an investigation.
Are you surprised she's taken this job? Because everything I'd read about her and written about her prior to this was she was supposed to be shrewd, steeped in impartiality, a model civil servant. Do you think she didn't realise just how big a row this would trigger?
I'm not sure, really. I mean, it's hard to be able to speak on her behalf. I don't know her personally. I have actually heard very good things about Sue Gray, and that she isn't particularly political, in inverted commas, and lots of people do speak to her sense of professionalism, dedication to the job and hard work. So at the same time, I think there's people who are her allies are surprised by her taking this decision and the rapidity of it. I think there are some in the civil service that are sort of scratching their heads wondering whether she did predict that it would cause this fallout. But I think to be linked to the Partygate probe on one hand and then to be linked to Keir Starmer on the other isn't the best look.
And, of course, you alluded to that, Camilla, in your first answer. She's in charge of ethics and propriety. She may know of all sorts of other investigations that are underway into perhaps Conservative MPs, Liberal Democrat MPs, and working in the Cabinet Office too. She's got access to all sorts of highly sensitive government information, which she can take all along with her to her new job in the Labour HQ.
Yes, I mean, to be fair, there will be a strong argument to suggest that, look, people can leave newspapers and go to other newspapers. People can leave companies and go to other companies, and they don't share sensitive information that might scupper their previous employer. But at the same time, yeah, I think that's why the Cabinet Office is right to look at this and to ask these questions, to say, well, look, what information has she been party to? What information could be potentially prejudicial to the government should she take it to the leader's office? And how is she going to manage what she knows in regard to her new job?
Can I ask you, Camilla, about the Telegraph's ongoing lockdown files? I think it's, day 3, day 4 now. The latest talking about how the government were pleased that the police were so actively arresting people, putting people in court for apparently breaking lockdown rules.
Yeah, I'm just having a look at the front page here. Sorry, shameless plug, but yeah, we are going to have to get heavy with the police. And that's a quote from Matt Hancock. And I think what today's revelations beg the question of is why Matt Hancock, as Health Secretary, was involved in any decision-making when it came to police enforcement. We've got some quite interesting analysis here. Obviously, the police are pushing back on it, about the independence of the police force from government. And yet, at the same time, a great number of messages exchanged about how they wanted the police to go heavy on the public. Now, I think the public understands that there was a need to enforce some of these rules, even if they didn't agree with them. But we know of those cases cases, Andrew, where a sledgehammer was used to crack a nut. We won't forget, will we, the two women who met in Derbyshire on a park bench with a cup of coffee and were fined 200 quid because the police accused them of holding a picnic. I mean, they did apologise for that and the ladies got their money back, but it did enormous damage, not only to people's questioning of the rules and their legitimacy, this unprecedented enforcement against our own civil liberties, but also the police's rather heavy-handed behaviour towards people who were trying to make the best fist of a very difficult situation.
And Camilla, what of Nigel Farage, of course, because that's delicious revelations in your files today about the police and ministers wanting the police to go and arrest Nigel Farage for allegedly breaking lockdown rules.
Yes, is he a pub hooligan? That may be a discussion for another day with Nigel. I mean, it does lay bare the ludicrous nature of some of the messages in respect of, you know, the jokiness around some of the rhetoric. Look, at the end of the day, I think there'll be some that argue that if all of our WhatsApps were published, then we'd all probably be revealed to have made some choice and unwise remarks. In this case, though, the idea of trying to throw Nigel Farage in prison for having a pint perhaps before his 14-day quarantine period ended does speak to the ludicrous nature of some of these rules. I mean, you know, don't enforce rules on the public that are almost impossible to follow. There's also some other stuff that is jokey by those involved, but I mean, wouldn't have been felt to have been funny by the people who it affected. For instance, this joke about whether people were going into quarantine hotels, and at some point Matt Hancock says to Simon Case, 147 people have gone into quarantine hotels voluntarily. And Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, then replies, hilarious. Well, it wasn't hilarious for the people that are having to do that instead of going back to work.
Actually, just finally on this, Camilla, there's a huge war of words, predictably, between Matt Hancock, who, of course, published his own rather different pandemic diaries, and Isabel Oakeshott, the journalist who wrote them for him. He says it's the most appalling breach of trust and faith, and she signed a non-disclosure agreement. She argues it's all in the public interest. I'm with her. It is in the public interest.
Of course it's in the public interest. I mean, anyone who thinks that the most important aspect of this story is Isabel Oakeshott needs to perhaps take a long, hard look at themselves. What we've got here is 100 messages.
Camilla, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We've going to got some breaking news. Just one moment. That's Camilla Tominey. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson will give evidence to the Privileges Committee in the week beginning March the 20th on the inquiry into whether he lied to Parliament, the committee's told us today. In the studio with me, of course, is Ed Vaity. Ed, so this is Boris Johnson's... This Privileges Committee investigation could bring the end of his political career.
Yes, I mean, following the twists and turns of Partygate and what it means and whether... Because Boris, of course, got up at the dispatch box and said there were no parties at number 10 and so on. So the accusation is that he lied to Parliament, and people think that this is a very dangerous moment for Boris Johnson if he gives evidence to this committee and the committee finds against him. They could sanction him, they could suspend him potentially from the House of Commons, and that would be obviously extremely damaging. I don't think they can eject him from the House of Commons, but if a former Prime Minister gets suspended from the House of Commons...
It's pretty serious.
It's a pretty serious thing.
That committee is chaired by the Labour MP Harriet Harman, who we know has already gone public to say that Boris Johnson broke the rules long before she was put in charge of this committee. So she's made her mind up already. Now, the Sue Gray report is interesting because that was going to form a large part of the committee's deliberations. Is that now disqualified from that Privileges Committee investigation because people are now rightly calling into question whether she was an objective observer? We don't know when she started talking to Keir Starmer, but she is going to be his chief of staff.
Well, I'm in the Sue Gray camp on this one. I don't think her report is compromised in any shape or form. And just to be clear, I defended Boris Johnson endlessly over Partygate when the whole row was going on. I was on programmes like this all the time saying I didn't think it was a resigning matter. I'm a lockdown sceptic myself anyway. I could understand why people are so angry. In fact, Isabel Oakeshott, I once went on a programme with her where she was kind of absolutely going for Boris because, of course, she, as a lockdown sceptic, couldn't bear the fact that the people who made these terrible rules were breaking them. But I defended Boris on that. But having said that, so, you know, you said in your introduction, it was 8 months ago. I do not believe that Sue Gray was talking to Keir Starmer 8 months ago. If she was, I'd agree that could be a factor. Secondly, Sue Gray is a kind of, you know, she's like Reservoir Dogs. You know, she cleans up the messes. She's been trusted by prime ministers for decades. She interviewed me for the Ofcom job, which went to Michael Grade. She carried out Boris Johnson's orders to make sure that Michael Grade got the job and I didn't get the job. She followed orders for prime ministers time and again and cleaning up their messes. And don't forget, she only got the inquiry because Simon Case couldn't do it because he was compromised. It wasn't as though she kind of manoeuvred her way in as a Labour mole to get the inquiry.
Stay there, Ed. So just going to go back to Camilla Tominey. Camilla, what do you think? Boris Johnson now, we've got a date for when he's going to go before this committee. Is the Sue Gray report now too toxic to be a part of that committee's considerations?
I'm not sure. I mean, at the end of the day, Partygate happened. I think the bigger question around this particular inquiry is the notion of whether he knowingly misled Parliament or not. You know, the Tory supporters' argument with this is that the goalposts have been shifted, and rather than just knowingly misled Parliament, this is now going to be an inquiry about whether he misled Parliament, which is a far, bigger remit for which his likelihood to be found guilty is much bigger. So I think not a great day for him or indeed his champions. But then you could arguably say that with Rishi Sunak having secured his Brexit deal, it's not been a great week for Boris Johnson, full stop.
Just on that, do you detect any diminution of support for that deal in Parliament? Are Tory MPs still as gung-ho? Because the more people are going into the detail, the less some people are saying they like it.
Well, I think that in the background, the Brexiteers are waiting for the Star Chamber of Lawyers to give them their verdict on this. I'm not hearing, overwhelmingly encouraging mood music from them, but they're holding their counsel. Also, the DUP, again, we haven't got their full verdict on it. We heard from Boris Johnson at the Global Soft Power Summit yesterday saying that he didn't really like the deal and he'd rather that they stuck with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. Now, he would, wouldn't he? But I think this initial sort of very warm mood music from the likes of Lee Anderson and others has been slightly watered down, and I'll be very intrigued to see what people are saying in the Brexiteer Spartan camp come the weekend.
Absolutely. That's Camilla Tominey. Don't forget, you can see her here every Sunday morning with her fabulous political show. Ed Vaizey, Lord Vaizey, Sue Gray, so do you think there should be a period of time elapsing before she leaves that job in the Cabinet Office, which she's already left, and takes up that job with Keir Starmer? So we pointed out in the Mail today, there was somebody involved in a senior job in Number 10, been appointed to the House of Lords. She wouldn't let her take up that job for a year. Let me just tell you, I'll tell you.
Don't worry, I wasn't just... I was genuinely interested. Yeah. No, I don't think there should necessarily be a period of... I mean, in some ways, we should be rejoicing. Keir Starmer is leader of the opposition. He's never held a cabinet minister position, a bit like David Cameron when he became... It
was Laura Wilde. She was the head of the Downing Street Honours team.
Her. She's a great member of the House of Lords. Don't know why she was delayed.
But because Sue Gray delayed her appointment for a year.
Okay. Well, I think we should rejoice that Sue Gray is going to work for Keir Starmer as Democrats. We want the leader of the opposition, who could potentially be our next Prime Minister, to be fully versed in the workings of government, to have a very senior person working for him who's going to show him how to navigate Whitehall, get things done if he becomes Prime Minister, and that's by no means certain. And no, I don't think Sue Gray is the sort of person who's going to come with, cardboard, Trump-like, with cardboard boxes of classified files and dump them on Keir's desk and say, go for it. In fact, given this row, it's even more unlikely that she would. I don't know Sue Gray, I've met her a few times, but I know her reputation. I don't think she'd do that because it would completely compromise her position. And if they are going to go into government, Sue Gray wants to ensure that the people working for that government don't breach confidentiality.
She could have just carried on where she was, and then when Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, he could have just brought her into Number 10.
Yes, it's very, very noble for her to give up her civil service career, take the brickbats from the press in order to get the opposition leader oven ready.
Right, now what
should he become Prime Minister?
Let me ask you about the lockdown files. Matt Hancock is flailing, he's lashing out at Isabel Oakeshott, but it isn't about how the information got into the public domain. It's what's in the public. In the public. Yes. It's about what ministers were doing and what they were saying on WhatsApp. The row over whether schools should have closed. The latest they're talking about today. We want the police to get really aggressive with the public. We need to know all this.
Yeah, well, I mean, well done to the Telegraph as a victim of the expenses files in 2008.
I was there at the time. I might have been the one who called you to say you're in trouble.
Terrible kind of sick feeling moment of when the Telegraph email came through for every MP. It was an absolute...
What did you do wrong?
It was hell on earth. Furniture. I got done for furniture.
How much did you spend on it?
We can look it up in Wikipedia. It's still there, despite me
thousands
desperate to get it removed.
Thousands on the public purse.
Millions.
You went to one of those posh shops, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
You didn't
go to IKEA like most voters, people watching this good. You went to a really upmarket shop and you spent a lot of money on your bed.
Oh.
I remember.
No, I don't think I bought a bed,
right.
actually.
OK.
It's all I don't know why that entered your head, Andrew.
The public inquiry will be coming up, April, May? Labour is saying it should have been a lot sooner. It's a bit rich coming from them, isn't it? When did the Iraq war inquiry finally report?
Exactly.
2013?
Look, it's not a great way. It's a great scoop for the Telegraph. I personally don't think it's a great way to behave when... I think it's unusual that Matt Hancock was able to use his WhatsApp messages to write his book, albeit he gave all the profits to charity. But apparently it was done in conjunction with the Cabinet Office, and Isabel Oakeshott was brought on board. I went to the book launch of Matt Hancock's diaries, and I could sort of sense that Isabel Oakeshott wasn't entirely happy with the experience. So I think there's an element...
She told me she didn't like him at all.
Exactly, and
So
I think there's an element... I think there's an element of...
Was he difficult to work with? You were in government with him.
Yes, nightmare. Terrible to work with. He was a deputy chair of the Cabinet subcommittee that I chaired, and
he was difficult?
It'll be no surprise that he was very quickly co-chair.
Right. Because he was a control freak.
Well, I mean, I've never really understood ambition, but people are just hung up on titles, and, I just chugged along.
That's probably why he got
job.
in the Cabinet, and you never did.
Well, you can imagine when I was sacked by Theresa May from the job that I absolutely loved.
Culture
I kind
Minister.
of took it on the chin.
Yeah.
6 years, until an hour later somebody rang and said, Matt Hancock's got your job.
Oh, dear. That's Ed Vaizey, Lord Vaizey. Coming up after the break, we're going to talk about the 2-year anniversary since Sarah Everard was abducted, raped and murdered by the serving police officer Wayne Couzens.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pearce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You're of busking.
It's the second anniversary since the Sarah Everard was kidnapped, raped and brutally killed by the serving police officer Wayne Couzens, who admitted to almost sentenced to a whole life term. Sadiq Khan has said his thoughts with the family and loved ones of Sarah Everard today and all those who've been impacted by her death. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but I just want to come back before we go on to that subject. Ed Vaizey, Boris Johnson can be an incredibly strong performer.
Yes.
But he's not great on detail, and when he goes before that Privileges Committee, he's going to have to be on best behaviour and he's going to be on good form.
Yes, well, he's earning a lot of money at the moment, so hopefully he's hired some good lawyers. And I think it's a very fair point. Boris is a busker. It works pretty much every time, even when he's giving speeches, but there will probably be, you've already alluded to the fact the chair is Harriet Harman, there will probably be a forensic kind of line-by-line analysis of what he said in the Commons and what actually we know now actually happened in Downing Street, and an attempt to kind of say, what do you mean by party and so on. So he's got to be right. I mean, again, I am sympathetic to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson.
I do.
Boris Johnson in a crowd is hail fellow, well met, but he's actually quite a shy and reserved person. And I don't think he kind of, got on down at these parties and passed the red wine. But I also think he's quite an easygoing bloke, and if people were doing stuff, he sort of probably found it quite difficult to say, hold on, this is completely beyond the bounds.
Does it matter,
Plus,
though?
we know he was a lockdown sceptic.
Yeah.
In fact, I think one of the good things from the WhatsApp dump is, I think, I am on the side of Boris. People are saying, oh, this is a terrible thing. He wanted the old to die or whatever. But Boris, you could see him fighting for the country.
He was. He
saying,
did not want to close the country down.
For goodness sake, think twice.
Yeah. Just and on the lockdown, does it matter whether he misled Parliament or intentionally misled Parliament? There is a big difference.
Yeah, I think there is a massive difference. That's the point. I think there's a massive difference. You might have known. The reason I defend it on Partygate is that if everyone is working 18-hour days in Downing Street, I fail to see why adding a glass of red wine to that mix increased the risk of transmission. And if Boris said, look, as far as I was concerned, people were in Downing Street all the time, and I would not have said if somebody had a glass of red wine, that's a party. Did he know that people were kind of throwing red wine on the walls and dancing till 2 in the morning and bringing in karaoke machines, and it was the civil servants bringing them in?
Yeah.
So I could easily have stood up at the dispatch box if I'd had Boris Johnson's job and said, as far as I'm aware, there were no parties. And I think there is a big difference between knowingly lying and unintentionally misleading the Commons.
Fascinating. So it's March the 20th is the date. Boris Johnson is robust about this, and he says that he will defend himself at this committee. GBNews political reporter Catherine Forster joins me now. Catherine, this is keenly awaited, March the 20th. It's going to be all eyes on Boris and Harriet Harman. Of course, Boris will make the point that Harriet Harman's already made her view clear. She said in the Commons that he broke the rules, and yet she's chairing this committee to decide whether he misled Parliament.
Well, indeed, yes, some concerns about that. But this is long awaited, isn't it? We've been waiting for months and months and months to really hear from the Privileges Committee and what they are up to. And of course, with all Partygate being revisited yesterday, this is all very topical now. So the report, about 30 pages, was published by the Privileges Committee just about 12:10. And we know that they are saying this is not about Partygate. They're not interested in digging that over. This is purely about Boris Johnson and whether or not he knowingly misled Parliament. Now, they've stressed that there's 100 instances a year of MPs misleading Parliament inadvertently. So the question is if he realised. Now, I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing yet, but they are saying that breaches of coronavirus guidance would have been obvious to Boris Johnson at several events he attended, and they've published pictures. So that doesn't sound good, and Boris Johnson, obviously, on the week beginning 20th of March, will have a lot of questions to answer, and that will be very keenly awaited for what he says.
All right, that's Catherine Forster with us in Downing Street. Ed Vaizey, that they are saying knowingly, intentionally misled.
Yes, well, I just don't believe that Boris Johnson did knowingly intelligence. Now, you and I both know that politicians can
But at one party,
economical...
his child's swing got broken because apparently two people were having sex on it.
Yeah, well,
that's a party.
Well, was Boris Johnson there? No.
He wasn't there at the time.
I think you would remember if two people were having sex,
But this was during lockdown when people were following the rules set by this government, some of the most onerous rules we've ever had imposed on us in peacetime, and there they were.
Look, I do not condone that behaviour, particularly as I was a lockdown sceptic. What I'm saying is I didn't condemn Boris Johnson for it because I didn't think Boris Johnson knew the extent of what was going on. And I also think Boris took the view, as a lockdown sceptic, albeit having to impose these laws, that toasting somebody with a glass of wine in a room full of people who've been spent all the day working together was not, I had a glass of wine with my family when we were in lockdown. I didn't think I was having a party because I had a glass of wine in the evening because we were all in the house together. So that was my problem. And knowingly, I think, is crucial here because I think Boris, what I was going to say is we all know that politicians are economical with the truth, that famous phrase.
Were you?
And we all know that you could be at the dispatch box and use words in a way that you hope doesn't give a bald admission to what is being asked, but is still credible. And that may be what Boris Johnson did, but that is not knowingly misleading.
Third time of asking. Were you knowingly economical with the truth, Lord Vasey, when you were a minister?
I never got asked difficult questions, so it was fine.
Right, that's...
And also, nobody ever told me anything, so I couldn't lie about it.
OK, you should have talked to me. I knew all sorts of things. Now, coming up after the headlines, we'll be talking about the 2-year anniversary since Sarah Everard was abducted, raped and murdered by the serving police officer Wayne Couzens. And we'll have more reaction to the latest police developments.
Good afternoon, it's 12:33. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson will give evidence to the Privileges Committee later this month following allegations he misled Parliament over Partygate. The former Prime Minister's set to give evidence the week commencing March the 20th. Mr Johnson says it was his honest belief the rules and guidance had been followed and that there's no evidence he knowingly or recklessly misled Parliament. The Privileges Committee says breaches of coronavirus rules would have been obvious to him at the time. Meanwhile, Mr Johnson's spoken out on the appointment of Sue Gray as Sir Keir Starmer's new Chief of Staff, calling it particularly concerning. That comes as Jacob Rees-Mogg says the appointment invalidates her report into lockdown breaches at number 10.
Former MP accepted her 2 reports on the strict understanding that she was impartial, and that now looks wrong. No confidence can be placed in the evidence she secured or passed to the police, so instead there should be an investigation into her and to her appointment. We should have an inquiry into what she has done and her contacts with Labour whilst she's been a civil servant, particularly those with the office of the Leader of the Opposition.
A Nobel Peace Prize winner and pro-democracy activist has been sentenced in a Belarus court to 10 years in prison for funding protests. Alice Bialyatsky, whose human rights group provided legal and financial aid to protesters during a 2020 wave of unrest in Belarus, has also been convicted of tax evasion. He claims he's being prosecuted for political reasons. Russian news agency TASS, that's reporting on the sentencing, says the verdict is likely to be strongly condemned by the West. And it may well be March, but a cold weather alert's being issued for parts of the UK at the start of next week. The UK Health Security Agency says freezing temperatures and wintry showers are forecast across England from Monday, bringing with it a risk of ice. The Met Office, meanwhile, has issued a snow warning for parts of Scotland and the northeast of England. The cold snap's expected to last until midnight on Wednesday. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Andrew.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one.
Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like
Absolutely.
on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, The People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Well, today's the second anniversary since Sarah Everard was kidnapped, raped and brutally killed by serving police officer Wayne Couzens. He was sentenced to a whole life term. The London Mayor Sadiq Khan says his thoughts are with the family and loved ones of Sarah Everard today. Joining me on the show now is Gemma Aitchison, who's the founder of Yes Matters, which is a charity which campaigns for women's rights. Gemma, a very sad day for the family of Sarah Everard. They'll never, ever get over it, of course. Do you think things have improved much for women? Do women feel safer now, perhaps, than they did 2 years ago on the streets of our towns and cities?
It will be very difficult for her family for many years to come. But no, I don't think things have improved at all. I think the police have doubled down and been defensive instead of acknowledging and actually addressing issues. And not just the police, the CPS, the whole justice system really have issues with dealing with violence against women and girls, including probation, as we know from the murder of Sarah a few weeks ago. I don't think women and girls do feel safer, and I think their trust in the justice system to deal with that is at an all-time low, and I don't think it's improving.
What do they need to do to improve it, things, Gemma?
I think that they need to take on, just like any professional does, they need to take on the feedback instead of getting defensive about it and saying it's only a few bad apples, instead of having that defensive, deflexive reaction. They need to listen to organisations that deal with victims day in and day out on the front line, and they really need to change how they train their police officers. You know, most police officers don't have training in domestic abuse, even though that is a huge number of the call-outs they get. It's quite crazy and ridiculous that is allowed to happen. Any other professional who wasn't trained in something that they dealt with day to day would be told they weren't fit to practice, they weren't qualified to practice. It should be the same with police officers. They need to be trained in what they're doing.
And Gemma, for you, that you've got a personal interest in this, which explains a lot of your work with Yes Matters.
Yeah, my sister, Sasha Marsden, was raped and murdered 10 years ago this year. And for me, the work that I've been doing, the thing that doesn't seem to change is that we don't take violence against women and girls seriously. When you think about Wayne Couzens or Carrick or David Minto in my sister's case, they all have a history of offences that were dismissed and not taken seriously until there was unfortunately that dead body at the end, and we're still making that same mistake.
Do you think the fact that police officers now, we saw it with Cousins, and you just referred to David Carrick, he got a life sentence with a minimum term of 30 years for a reign of terror against women. Do you think the fact that police officers in uniform are involved will now perhaps finally get some serious action from the police?
I think it's not just the police officers themselves, that the perpetrator police officers. It's the ones that knew about them. Many of them knew about Carrick. Wayne Couzens had, the horrible nickname that he had within the force. So it isn't as if these people who are perpetrators within the police aren't known about. So not only do the officers themselves need addressing, but I want to know about what's being done about all the people that condoned and enabled that person to continue. I want to know what's happening to those officers too.
All right, Gemma, that's Gemma Aitchison, who's the founder of Yes Matters, whose own sister, who was only 16, was raped and murdered 10 years ago. Ed Vaizey, the police's reputation has never been so low, ever.
No, I mean...
And each week we seem to be hearing of another police officer being charged.
And I think Gemma was right. I mean, I think the police get very, very defensive over these things. Now, look, this was a police officer in uniform who kidnapped, raped and murdered a woman, picked her off the street, used his authority to do so. Somebody else, as you said, has
David Carrick did it again and
for 30 years. You can't be defensive about this. You've got to be open about it. There's still, to a certain extent, a canteen culture in the police force. There's a defensive mentality, a sort of circle the wagons mentality. And they have to understand why the public has lost confidence, not least related to the fact that very few crimes now appear to be kind of investigated and detected. So there has to be kind of root and branch reform. I feel very strongly, or very sorry in some ways, for the police leadership, because the turning this ship around is going to be very, very difficult.
I mean, it's a cliche, but I think it's true. People would be more confident if they actually saw a bobby on the beat, if they saw a police car.
I agree with you.
If the police actually responded when you report that your house has been burgled.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think there's lots of things you can change about the police which are important but dull. For example, financial crime, I think we should beef up. Most people now suffer crime from some scam email.
Yeah.
So you could recruit people who you never see to do that kind of work. But then the reassuring presence of seeing a police person, man or woman, not in a car, walking down the street is a very good thing, because people just feel reassured that there's help on the way. Having said that, look, some of these terror attacks, for example, where the police have responded within minutes, been unbelievably brave in taking on the attackers. The police still do a very good job by and large, and we are still a relatively safe country. But there needs to be a kind of hearts and minds strategy now with the British public.
Absolutely. That's Lord Vaizey. He's with me here until 1 o'clock. He's a Conservative peer, former government minister. And earlier this week, of course, it's a story that won't go away, the royals. King Charles, apparently, had asked Harry and Meghan, or told them, that they're going to vacate Frogmore Cottage. That's the 5-bedroom cottage on the Windsor estate. Harry and Meghan's spokesperson said a request had been made for them to give up Frogmore Cottage. It will remove their last foothold in the UK, their ties to the royal family being weakened. There is talk that it's been offered to Prince Andrew instead. He lives in a 30-room house called Windsor Royal Lodge. It's very large, I know, because I've been there. And he's got, in the grounds of that Windsor Royal Lodge, a helipad, because I was going to interview him for the day, and we went by helicopter to Birmingham. I did say to Prince Andrew, and you wonder why people call you Air Miles Andy. Why aren't we on a train? Joining me to talk about the latest twists and turns in the endlessly fascinating Meghan and Harry saga is Richard Fitzwilliams, the royal commentator. Richard, I can't really see that Meghan and Harry can have any cause for complaint. They've moved to the United States. Their new life is in California with their millionaire chums.
Oh, I agree with you. I think also that, one has to bear in mind the background to this. I mean, going back to the Oprah interview, which did the royal family so much harm, but if you just go from last December, when they were releasing trailers for the 6 hours on the Netflix docuseries Harry and Meghan put out, and the one trailer appeared to be deliberately timed to cause problems for the Prince and Princess of Wales when they were visiting Boston. Then you had the 6 hours, which for a couple who boast they want privacy was simply bizarre with all the intimate texts and so on, but infinitely more serious. Of course, they were trashing the Commonwealth with some of the talking heads they were using. There was a brief break for Christmas, and then we had Spare, the memoir, endless interviews, including one tomorrow with Dr. Gabor Mate, who's a very, very controversial figure. Harry has very, very clearly put the boot in, and there's no question that it's been embarrassing. Almost, well, all the senior members of the royal family, the very senior ones, have been under attack, including Camilla. So this is what King Charles decided to do. And it's interesting that no one, as far as I know, thought of this particular option. There were talk about taking their titles away, or that their children wouldn't get titles, or indeed of some form of reconciliation. What the Sussexes want is an apology. They certainly won't get that.
Commentator with me in the studio is Cameron Walker, our royal reporter, because you've got some breaking news about the King and the Queen.
I do, yes. This is from Buckingham Palace in the last few minutes. The King and Queen consorts, their first state visit of the new reign will be taking place later this month to France and Germany. This has been rumoured for some time, but now we have it official. The King and Queen consorts' first state visit to France and Germany. There is going to be many engagements to do with climate change and sustainability, as perhaps would be expected with King Charles, the response to the conflict in Ukraine, trade and investment opportunities, and shared the best of our arts and culture, collective arts and culture. It's understood this was at the request of the British government, actually trying to increase relationships with Europe. There were questions perhaps as to why their first state visit wouldn't be to a Commonwealth nation rather than Europe. I think perhaps maybe so close to the coronation. Clearly the Commonwealth countries are very far away and they are both in their 70s, so perhaps that slightly played a part in it. But one of the questions for me, and I think this is going to become a bit of a sticking point over the next 3 weeks for Buckingham Palace, who is going to act as councillors of state for the King, on behalf of the King?
Now, just to remind people what a Councillor of State is.
Well, a Councillor of State is there to deputise on behalf of the King, signing official state papers, undertaking everything the King does to do with the constitutional matters of the United Kingdom. So by law, 5 Councillors of State, the Queen Consort as the monarch's spouse, and then the 4 most senior in line to the throne over the age of 21, which is, at the moment, as it stands, the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Sussex, Harry, the Duke of York, Prince Andrew, and Princess Beatrice, Prince Andrew's youngest daughter.
Oh, what a collection.
Exactly. Now, the King did express his wish, or he would be content, in a message to the House of Lords, for his other 2 siblings, Prince Edward and Princess Anne, to deputise on behalf of him. However, that is not in legislation as it stands. So at the moment, they are going to have to choose, because you have to have 2 councillors of state. It's going to be clearly the Prince of Wales as heir to the throne, and then have to pick one of those 3.
And they're surely going to drop Harry and Andrew, because Andrew no longer does any royal duties and Harry's walked away, packed his trunk and gone off to the California circus.
Well, perhaps. I think it would be very difficult for them to pick either one of those 2, which leaves Princess Beatrice, unless the legislation is rushed through. I'm not sure what they're going to do. Buckingham Palace, on that particular point, are not commenting.
What do you think they should do, Lord Vasey? If you were advising, as a minister, you would see members of the royal family on a one-to-one basis?
Well, speaking as a peer of the realm, obviously, waiting for this important legislation, which I can opine on about who should be the Councillor of State, I would go for Princess Beatrice. I've met her a few times. She seems a very nice person.
Why not Princess Anne?
Oh, well, I like her too. I was bowing to the expert in the room, Andrew, who said Princess Beatrice is the only game...
Couldn't they make her a Councillor of State?
Well, they've got to get it passed through the House of Lords. And I'll tell you something. Yesterday, I put in my application to go to the coronation. You know, you can enter a ballot to get a ticket to the coronation. Do you think they fixed it? Do you think it's a genuine ballot, or do you think...
It won't be a genuine... They won't.
Weirdly, all the most senior peers will get the tickets.
They want senior important peers there, which rules you out. So that's Lord Vasey. He doesn't mind me teasing him a little bit. I don't mind if he does, actually. Now, today, the presenter with the largest listening figures in Britain will bow out from the BBC. They're doing pretty well, my listening figures. Ken Bruce is going to commercial radio after 45 years with The Beeb. His mid-morning show on Radio 2 had a reach of more than 7 million. Astonishing. He's going, of course, because at the age of 72, he's deemed too old. He's being replaced by Vernon Kay. You know him? Age 48. Another sign to me that the publicly funded BBC is out of step and out of touch with the mood of the country. It's an endless quest to find a youth audience. Well, the journalist and broadcaster Carol Malone joins me now. Also, Tim Luckhurst, who is Professor Tim Luckhurst, who's principal of South College, Durham University, and a former BBC journalist. Afternoon to you both. Carol Malone, to you first. What do you think Ken Bruce has been chucked on the scrapheap because he is too old?
Well, the truth of it is he was offered a new deal. He's on about 400 grand at the moment, and he was offered a new deal, but he saw the way the wind is blowing, and so he was offered a better deal by Boom Radio, and that's why he's gone. But, you know, you have to wonder about the sanity and the sense of the bosses of Radio 2. Who on earth do they think is listening? They have this quest to get younger presenters in. Younger people are not listening to Radio 2. Older people are. And since they got rid of Paul O'Grady and since they got rid of Steve Wright, they have lost 600,000 listeners. Their youth policy isn't working. And let me tell you, so they've got rid of Wright, they've got rid of O'Grady, Ken Bruce has gone, Vanessa's gone. Guess who they've been replaced by? Pierce, I'm going to test you on this. Who is DJ Spoonie?
Never heard of him. Is it he or a she?
Exactly. No one
He or a
has.
she?
Well, that's a bloke. That's a bloke.
Right.
There's a Michelle Visage.
Never heard of them.
No, and they're replacing them with people that older people don't want to listen to, and they've even on those shows, they've got rid of the 60s, 70s and 80s music that made it popular. And now that music is doing so well on the commercial channels that are booming currently. So it just seems like they've got a death wish.
I think Tim Luckhurst, you're ex-BBC man. You've been critical of the BBC in the past and praised the BBC too. Carol Malone's right here. I mean, Radio 2 is having some form of midlife crisis because it's losing these seasoned, popular broadcasters.
I think there's a great deal of truth in what Carol says, and I think the BBC is making a very grave error by losing such popular broadcasters. But it is pursuing not just a younger audience, but also a very deliberate cost-cutting practice. The BBC knows that it's got to reduce what it pays its presenters. And one way that you reduce what you pay your presenters is by getting rid of very expensive, very experienced people with enormous audience appeal and trying to grow new presenters of your own. Now, that might save money, but in the short term, it's likely to shed listeners too. And I think that's a big problem for the BBC.
And is Carol right as well about when she talks about this, the craving of the youth, the youth listener? And I think she's right, isn't she? They're not going to tune into Radio 2. There's all these other channels they can go to.
You're absolutely right that they're not going to tune into BBC Radio 2, but there's an even bigger problem. The youth audience doesn't really listen to radio. The BBC's great challenge is that the youth audience tends to consume its news, if it consumes news or music at all, online or on streaming services. The mainstream broadcasters are not appealing to the youth audience, whether it's on television or through radio. Young people, my students, have different ways of getting the information and the entertainment they want. That's a colossal challenge for the BBC as a licence fee funded broadcaster. And it's one of the reasons why I think, as a fan of the BBC, and you're right, Andrew, that I've been a critic, but I'm also indeed a passionate defender of the notion of the BBC. The BBC as a cultural institution is very valuable to Britain, but it's going to have to get smaller. It's going to have to decide what it needs to do and what it does not need to do. And the BBC on the scale we've currently got really isn't going to survive. And I think music radio is a really big problem. I mean, answer the question for me. Can commercial radio not do music radio as well as the BBC? As far as I can see, commercial radio does music radio absolutely brilliantly. There is simply no need for Radio 2 and Radio 1. And I think Ken Bruce has probably made a sensible decision. He's going to a station where he's going to have a big audience.
Carol Malone.
You know, this is, and apart from, I mean, everything you just said I agree with, but this is also ageist. You know, there is a law, there is an equalities law in this country, and this is also rank hypocrisy from a company that prides itself on diversity and inclusion. You know, the BBC has a rule that says 20% of its talent has to come from barmaid backgrounds, disadvantaged socio-economic backgrounds, and disability, but there is no room here for older people. I mean, this is an ageist policy, and I get what you're saying about saving money, but it is an ageist policy. They got rid of Vanessa Feltz. Liz Kershaw says that as soon as she turned 60, they kicked her out. And this is crazy. Ken Bruce, he beat all the laws of the BBC laws. Breakfast is usually the show that has the most listeners. Ken Bruce beat that trend. He was beating Zoe Ball by 1 million listeners a week. And yet still, they make it easy for him to go. And I hope to God Ken Bruce takes the huge chunk of his listeners to Boom Radio, because Vernon Kay is good. I mean, he's good, but he's not Ken Bruce. And I hope the BBC pay a very high price for this ageist policy.
I think you're right. That's Carol Malone and Tim Luckhurst, Professor Tim Luckhurst, who's Principal of South College, Durham University. Thanks for joining me. Ed Vaizey, the last word to you. Culture Minister for 6 years. The BBC was a big part of your remit. It's insanity what's happening at Radio 2.
Well, I'm ahead of the game because I was on the front page of the Sunday Times in 2009 saying that Radio 1 should be abolished. Yeah. Because I do agree with Tim's analysis. We've got a really successful commercial radio stations in the UK who are great kind of export, success stories, and they can do, Radio 1 was set up because of pirate radio in the 1960s. It was set up as a specific government policy to combat pirate radio, and the BBC has to make tough choices and say, that ecosystem has evolved over the last 60 years. It's thriving. Does the BBC really need to be there? Their big problem is everyone pays the licence fee, so they think they have to provide something for everyone. But these are the kind of tough decisions that we pay the Director General to make.
Yeah, and we're paying too much for the licence fee.
Well, there is that point.
All right, that's Lord Vaizey. He'll come back and join me again, I hope.
Oh, really? Did I do well enough?
Well, it's average. You're watching Andrew Pierce and you're listening to Andrew Pierce here on GB News. Plenty more still to come in the next hour of the programme, so don't go anywhere. But before that, we're going to take a very quick break.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, this is Andrew Pierce. Welcome back to the show. Coming up in this hour, it's been revealed in the last few minutes that the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson is to give evidence to the Privileges Committee in the week beginning March the 20th on whether he misled Parliament knowingly about breaking coronavirus lockdown rules. We'll also be looking at a speech made by the former Prime Minister in which he says he'll find it very difficult to vote for Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. That is the much vaunted Windsor framework. And we'll also be taking a look at the latest GB News People's poll, which found only 8% of you thought King Charles meeting with the EU boss, Ursula von der Leyen, was a good idea. But before that, we're going to get the latest headlines.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon. It's 1:01, your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Commons Privileges Committee has said breaches of coronavirus rules in Downing Street would have been obvious to Boris Johnson at the time. The former Prime Minister's to give evidence in person about Partygate at the committee inquiry on March the 20th. He says it was his honest belief the rules and guidance had been followed and that there's no evidence he knowingly or recklessly misled Parliament. Meanwhile, Mr Johnson's calling the appointment of Sue Gray as Sir Keir Starmer's new Chief of Staff particularly concerning. The senior civil servant led an independent investigation into Partygate, but it was announced yesterday she was leaving the civil service to join the Labour Party. Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg calling for a proper inquiry into the appointment, saying it invalidates her report into lockdown breaches at Number 10.
Former MP accepted her two reports on the strict understanding that she was impartial, and that now looks wrong. No confidence can be placed in the evidence she secured or passed to the police, so instead there should be an investigation into her and to her appointment. We should have an inquiry into what she has done and her contacts with Labour whilst she's been a civil servant, particularly those with the office of the Leader of the Opposition.
Further leaked WhatsApp messages by Matt Hancock suggest his team asked if they could lock up Nigel Farage for being a pub hooligan and breaking lockdown rules. The messages revealed by The Telegraph were allegedly sent in 2020 after Mr Farage shared a video of himself drinking at a pub. A fortnight earlier, he was at a Trump rally in the US. Under COVID lockdown rules, anyone coming to England from abroad was required to quarantine for 14 days or face a £1,000 fine. At the time, Mr Farage said he wasn't breaking quarantine rules. However, he has since said he probably was.
When I was photographed that day the pub's open, had I reached the full 14 days? Well, it was a bit nip and tuck. I think probably I hadn't quite reached the time. I always made sure I used hand sanitizer. I always kept my distance from people. And I have to say, you know, bad laws make people lawbreakers.
The King and Queen Consort will make their first state visits to France and Germany at the end of the month. Buckingham Palace says the 6-day trip, beginning on the 26th of March, will celebrate Britain's relationship with both countries, marking shared histories, culture and values. The royal couple will travel to Paris and then onwards to Berlin. The trip will include a number of firsts, including the King being the first British monarch to give a speech from France's Senate chamber. Constance Martin and Mark Gordon are appearing in court after the remains of a baby were found in Brighton. The pair have been charged with gross negligence manslaughter, concealing the birth of a child and perverting the course of justice. The body of a newborn was found in an area of woodland in Hollingbury on Wednesday after a 2-day search. The couple, who were arrested on Monday, are appearing at Crawley Magistrates Court. The HS2 project could be delayed in an attempt to curb rising costs. That's according to the project's chief executive. The line's supposed to provide a faster rail service between London and Manchester, but there are reports it may no longer run to its planned terminal at Euston as a cost-saving measure. The project's chief executive now says the impact of inflation means they're having to look at ways of reducing costs further, including the timing and phasing of the project. Mourners have lined the streets to pay their respects to Leah Croucher, whose body was found in a house in Milton Keynes 4 years after she disappeared. A cortege for the 19-year-old has passed through Thurston in a public funeral procession. Thames Valley Police found human remains at a property last October following a tip-off from the public. Ms Croucher was last seen walking to work in February 2019. Neil Maxwell was found dead 2 months after Ms Croucher's disappearance. He remains the only suspect in the case. MP Neil Coyle has apologised in the House of Commons and said he's ashamed of his behaviour. That's after he was found to have breached Parliament's bullying and harassment policy. The The independent expert panel has recommended a 5-day suspension for the former Labour politician. It follows reports of foul-mouthed and drunken abuse of another MP's assistant. He's also accused of bullying and harassing a parliamentary journalist. Both instances took place in a Commons bar. A Nobel Peace Prize winner and pro-democracy activist has been sentenced in a Belarus court to 10 years in prison for funding protests. Ales Bialyatsky, whose human rights group provided legal and financial aid to protesters during a 2020 wave of unrest in Belarus, has also been convicted of tax evasion. He claims he's being persecuted for political reasons. Russian news agency TASS, reporting on the sentencing, says the verdict's likely to be strongly condemned by the West. And it may well be March, but a cold weather alert's being issued for parts of the UK at the start of next week. The UK Health Security Agency says freezing temperatures and wintry showers are forecast across England from Monday, bringing with it a risk of ice. The Met Office, meanwhile, has issued a snow warning for parts of Scotland and the northeast of England. The cold snap's expected to last until midnight on Wednesday. This is GB News. We're bringing more as it happens now, though. It's back to Andrew.
Thanks to Rihanna for that. Now, the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, it's going to happen. Finally, he's going to be called before that Privileges Committee in March, late March, on the inquiry into whether he lied knowingly to Parliament over Partygate. Members of the committee say evidence strongly suggests that breaches of coronavirus rules will have been obvious to Boris Johnson at the time he was at the gatherings. Joining me now is GB News political reporter Catherine Forster. Catherine, this could potentially, we can't exaggerate the importance of it, make or break his political career, because if the committee says he willingly and knowingly misled Parliament, potentially he could be suspended from Parliament.
Yes, he could be. This is very serious for Boris Johnson indeed, and it could be the end of his career as a Conservative MP in Parliament, less than a year after he was, in fact, Prime Minister. So this Privileges Committee has been working for many, many months, and we have been waiting, and finally it seems that there is movement. Boris Johnson will appear before them, we understand, the week beginning the 20th of March, and they have in the last hour published a 24-page document in which they've said that breaches of guidance would have been obvious to Boris Johnson at several events that he attended. They've published 4 new photographs that we haven't seen before, and they say that Parliament may have been misled. Boris Johnson's handed over 46 WhatsApp conversations, and witnesses have spoken to the Privileges Committee. Boris Johnson's been told the identity of those people. Now, the Privileges Committee is made up of 7 people. It's chaired by Labour MP Harriet Harman, although it actually does have a majority of Conservative MPs on it, 4 Conservative MPs. Now, Boris Johnson has been quick to rush out a statement in which he has said he has been vindicated. He said, "It is clear from this report that I have not committed any contempt of Parliament and have been vindicated. There is no evidence that I knowingly or recklessly misled Parliament." He goes on to say that he was not aware of any breaches taking place, that he relied on advice from his officials, and that nobody had warned him that any of these gatherings might have been inappropriate. The committee said that it seems he may have breached the rules. Boris Johnson saying absolutely that he hasn't been. And also he's had a dig at Sue Gray and the Sue Gray report, which is proving so controversial now that she's going to work for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. He's commented on the fact that the Privileges Committee used a lot of the material from the Sue Gray report, and in fact referenced her 26 occasions in this 24-page report that's just been published.
All right, that's Catherine Forster, our GB News political reporter in Downing Street. Scarlett Maguire, I'm delighted to say, is with me in the studio for the next hour, former Labour Party advisor. And, of course, you used to advise Harriet Harman, I think, didn't you?
I certainly did.
So wouldn't you be advising her then not to chair this committee when she's already told us what she thinks about Boris Johnson? She said in the Commons he broke the rules knowingly. So how can she be an impartial chairman?
No, absolutely not. Harriet is a trained lawyer and she's going into this as a lawyer. And she's not telling anybody, any of her friends, anybody what she's finding out.
You can't
and
expunge what she's already said.
She's just looking at the evidence. I mean, the fact is, it doesn't matter what you believe or what you don't believe. What's important is the evidence. And if we talk about Sue Gray and her investigation, right? What nobody's saying is that she was wrong, right? What nobody's saying is the things that she said happened didn't happen.
She said there was a failure of leadership at Number 10, which Boris was Prime Minister, so failure by him. It effectively wrecked his premiership. He had announced his resignation within 2 months.
What wrecked his premiership, right, was A, that we all know he had parties, right, and B, that Rishi Sunak, frankly, completely disagreed with him on economic policy, and then 50 ministers resigned within 24 hours. That was the end of the... I mean, actually, as far as the Labour Party was concerned, I mean, Sue Gray's investigation was pretty shallow. The so-called ABBA party that they had to celebrate the end of Dominic Cummings wasn't even investigated. So I mean, I actually think that if you talk to any Labour MPs, they'll say there was a lot more to look at that she decided not to.
What of the privilege investigation? 7 MPs, the Tories on there, some of them are no fans of Boris Johnson. If they find that he has knowingly misled Parliament, does he have to be suspended from Parliament?
Well, that's up to them, isn't it? I mean, they have to decide. I mean, I think they have to decide how egregious the breach was, right? Whether it was accidental, whether it was over and over again. Now, The Guardian online is publishing some of the WhatsApp messages
that Boris has made available.
That Boris has made available, and they are quite damning. I mean, they are people in his the PR people going, I don't see how we can spin this away. I don't see how this is within the rules. I mean, it is quite difficult to say how he thinks he's been vindicated.
Just on Sue Gray, and you don't think there's any problem whatsoever with Sue Gray going from her incredibly senior job in the Cabinet Office to work for Keir Starmer. If she could, she'd start next week. Yet when she was in charge of ethics in the Cabinet Office, she blocked somebody from the Downing Street Honours Unit going to the House of Lords for 12 months because of the political sensitivity. Far more political sensitivity involved here that she's going to work for the Leader of the Opposition with all the access to confidential information she's had in the last few years in the Cabinet Office.
So I think that what will happen is there will be a decision that will have nothing to do with Sue Gray or Keir Starmer about when she can join, right? And
do you think there should be a delay?
I think there will be a delay.
But she clearly just doesn't think so. She wants to join now. She's breaking her own code.
No, she isn't. She's put it in other people's... I mean, all she's done is she's given it to the people who'll make the decision, and they will make the decision. She's not saying, I think I should join now.
How long do you think the delay should be? Should it be a year, like the woman for the House of Lords?
I don't think... I mean,
that would take us to almost the next election.
To the election. I know. I don't know, because I don't know what these things are like, and I certainly know that that some of... I mean, there's somebody who's in the House of Lords working for Number 10 at the moment. I mean, that happens all the time. I mean, look, when Boris Johnson hired the guy who helped Labour through, when Labour was in government, through the financial crisis, right, from the Treasury, nobody made a peep. I mean, he knew all the secrets. I just think it happens a lot. You go for a good civil servant.
All right. I'm going to talk now to the former Conservative MP and Minister, Edwina Currie. Edwina, hello to you. Andrew. Edwina, what was your reaction to Sue Gray getting this job? And do you think, if it is allowed to go ahead, because there will be an investigation, first of all, should there be a delay?
I was quite shocked because ministers need to be able to trust their senior civil servants, in fact, all the civil service, absolutely. You need to be able to sit down with your civil servants and talk through a policy, talk through its implications, and know that the advice that you're getting is really unbiased. Indeed, when they say to you, Minister, you can't do this, or you shouldn't be able to do this, you need to know that that is proper, sound, impartial advice, and it's not coming from somebody who is actually quite hostile to you and more sympathetic to the other side. This will have to go to ACOBA, that's the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, but it's been widened. It's been in existence nearly half a century now, and it started off to stop civil servants going into business jobs where they were then going to exploit the information and the knowledge they had. Been much wider than that in more recent years. I think they should stop her from doing this job for 2 years. They can't veto it. They have to make a recommendation. But if she really wants to go and work for Keir Starmer, then she'll still want to do it in 2 years' time. And by then she won't be taking the secrets of the Prime Minister's office with her. That would be my feeling about an honourable way to do that.
Yeah, and on that, Lord Vasey, Ed Vasey, was on with me earlier, and he said, I don't think she's the sort who would utilise any of the intelligence and confidential information she'd got when she got to the Labour Party. I thought he was being staggeringly naive in saying so.
Well, I think integrity must not only be done, but it must be seen to be done, like justice. It can't be in any way watered down. She's a very remarkable woman. Anybody who's run a pub as well as being a top civil servant, comes into a category of people I would admire. But that said, she knows all about ethics, and I think there should be a big gap between her leaving the senior job that she has at the moment, where she knows an awful lot, and going straight into the leader of the opposition's job, where she could take those secrets with her. Whether she intends to or not, that's going to be the effect. So that would be my recommendation.
And Edwina, on Partygate, we now know that the week beginning the 20th of March, Boris Johnson will go before that Privileges Committee, chaired by Harriet Harman. Now, Scarlett McGrath in the studio here with me doesn't think it's an issue that Harriet Harman has said on the record in the Commons more than once, Boris Johnson knowingly misled Parliament, knowingly broke the rules. Does that, in your sense, disqualify her in any way from chairing this investigation?
Well, if I remember rightly, actually, it's mainly chaired by somebody else, by, I think, Chris Bryant, somebody who has already recused themselves. So Harriet sort of has taken over as a deputy. Now, I think the thing that surprised me about all this, Andrew, is Boris knows, as everybody does, that these events appearing before a committee, a select committee or whatever, is pure theatre. And if I were in Boris's shoes, I would have gone in saying, well, I'm terribly sorry, I've made a mistake, I was badly advised, or I took the advice that I was given, I'm terribly sorry. And that would have been an end of it, because you're sitting in front of a load of very pompous, self-righteous people. And if you're highly apologetic, there's nothing they can do to you. It looks as if he's chosen to do something different and chosen to fight. Now, if you're kind of fighting against the facts, and Scarlett would probably agree with me here, that's a lot harder to do. It's much better to just say terribly sorry and shut the thing down. And especially if there's no more facts to be delivered on this. So, when I appeared talking about eggs, there was a lot more information to come out, and I knew that I would be vindicated eventually. But that's not going to happen with Boris. The person who's going to suffer from this is the current Prime Minister, who really wants everything shut down so we can get on with running the country properly, getting everything onto an even keel, and not harking back to difficulties over the last 3 years.
All right, that's Edwina Currie, the former minister. You're going to get the view now, of course, of the political commentator Peter Spencer. Peter, Edwina Currie's right, isn't she? The Prime Minister will relish this like a hole in the head, because not least it will remind people that he also got a £50 fine for turning up at one of the parties. I think he was there for 2 minutes. Don't think he even had a cup of tea.
I don't think it'll be quite so bad for him, because you've got to remember that Boris Johnson has been plotting and scheming to get back to the top job in Downing Street. And he's been doing this for months, and indeed there's a solid grassroots Tory grouping which is aligned with the Tory membership, which says, that it was the Tory members chose him. They didn't choose either Rishi or or Liz Truss, and therefore we want the man back. Well, now, it seems to me very likely that this ticking time bomb is going to finally finish his career off, in which case Sunak can at least breathe a bit of a sigh of relief that that's one enemy within out of the picture.
Do you really think that committee will, because it's got a Tory majority, are Tory MPs really going to vote to bring down their former Prime Minister?
Well, you've got to remember that some 50 ministers voted with their feet and got Johnson out in the first place. And therefore, I mean, there's quite a lot who regard the brand as a great deal more important than the individual standard bearers. And if Boris Johnson brought the party into disrepute, then the sooner he's out of the picture, the better. I mean, when it comes to what Boris Johnson has now said, there was nothing to see here. I mean, it calls to mind the archetypal definition of chutzpah, which is the kid, right, who murders his parents and then in court pleads clemency because he's an orphan.
So if you were a betting man, Peter, I'm not sure if you are or you're not, is the end nigh?
For Boris Johnson?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would think it probably will be, yeah, because I suspect that the committee will come down very hard against him. And I suspect the upshot of that is he's suspended from Parliament, therefore ultimately he loses his seat in Uxbridge. And as a consequence of that, he's out of the picture. That said, he's been making absolute shed loads of money since he has left Parliament. And so he probably would, part of him would be thinking, well, I don't think I can afford to go back to being boring old Prime Minister anyway. It doesn't peanuts.
All right, that's Peter Spencer, the political commentator. Scarlett, I talk to Labour MPs and they say they fear Boris Johnson at a general election far more than Rishi Sunak because some people can't stand him, of course, but other people, it's like being out with a rock star. He's a great campaigner, undeniably. Keir Starmer, I know you like him, but he is so painfully dull.
He's not painfully dull, but let's talk about Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what we don't know is how tired the country is of Boris Johnson. I mean, remember, he promised levelling up. We haven't seen anything. He promised 40 new hospitals. The thing about Boris Johnson, he's a great campaigner. He can't do anything once he wins, right? I mean, that has been his problem. And, I mean, you know, he was a terrible Prime Minister, only beaten by the woman who came after him. So, actually, but I do understand that what Labour are worried about is that up against him campaigning. I mean, Boris is not entirely truthful, as we know, and he's certainly not truthful on the road. And you just think if he's going to start getting people worked up that he makes all these promises, both in the Brexit and in the general election, he did it. You know, I mean, we were told the Northern Ireland Protocol was brilliant.
We were told by your side that we were going to go into the worst recession ever if we dared to vote for Brexit. We did vote for Brexit and we did not go into the worst recession. Now, that's Scarlett Maguire. She's staying with me. Coming up after the break, we're going to get our GB People's poll. But before that, we're going to have a quick break.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So the GB News People's Poll has just been published, and I think it's fascinating. 60% of those polled think lockdown during the pandemic was the right decision. Scarlett Maguire, there we have lockdown sceptics. Ed Vaizey, Lord Vaizey was in that chair before. He was a lockdown sceptic. I was a sceptic over the second lockdown, but I absolutely went along with the first one.
I went along with the first one because there didn't seem to be any option. I mean, we didn't have vaccinations, right? No. It was definitely killing people, and it was definitely. I mean, there were going to be an awful lot. I mean, people who I knew, elder people, who were sort of stuck in their homes, and actually, so the good thing to do was to. I mean. I did go for walks every day. I mean, yeah. I did not lock myself down, but I think that people sort of looked and thought, what's the other option? I mean, I think a lot of people actually locked down before the government said we had to.
Yeah, and actually, the Prime Minister took the country with him. He was very impressive in those days. You remember when he talked to the nation, Boris Johnson?
Yeah. I mean, before he got COVID.
Yeah.
Right. Remember, he got it and nearly died.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, he was the proof of that's what happens. Because obviously it was completely rife in number 10, where they were all madly mixing with each other.
I can remember just before the lockdown being at a reception in the House of Commons, and they were coming around with bowls of peanuts, and people were putting their hands in one, and I thought, are you all mad? There wasn't a hand sanitizer anywhere in there. And I called the Speaker's office, Lindsay Hoyle, and said, you've got to sort it out, man. They did within about 2 days. But the MPs and the thousands of people who worked there were carrying on as if nothing was happening.
I mean, I'm amazed that no MP died.
Yeah.
Because it was absolutely rife, not just in number 10, but throughout the whole Houses of Parliament.
And people forget 10,000 people are pass holders there. They're coming from all over the country, MPs.
Yeah.
It was a Petri dish.
It was.
Thought that was the last time I went there until well after lockdown. I thought, I ain't going back there. Because it was so scary.
No, and they were all hugging each other.
Yeah, they were.
Because they thought they were above it. There was this slight thing that actually Boris did have at the beginning, is that I remember when King Charles he was Prince at the time, and it was, oh, well, you know, he's a perfectly healthy man, he'll be OK. There was a thing that actually people like us don't catch it, only the Italians.
That's Scarlett Maguire. We've got some breaking news coming up.
I just want to say that I'm happy and relieved that this matter is finally over. Today's sentence is a vindication of what I've been put through and sends a clear message that the police and the courts take this matter very seriously. I want to let all other victims of this crime know that I stand in solidarity with them, and I have absolutely no regrets on waiving my anonymity. I hope that this puts anyone off committing this sort of crime, and I hope for anyone else who's been victim of it, it gives them some sort of justice. Thank you so much for all of your support, and yeah, that's it. Well done. Thank you.
So that was Georgia Harrison talking after the conviction of her ex-boyfriend Stephen Bear, who's been sentenced to 21 months in prison for sharing revenge porn. She gave up her anonymity, and that was her speaking. Scarlett Maguire, always brave when a woman does that.
Incredibly brave, because there are masses and masses of women out there who've had that happen to them and have not been able to do anything because they've been shamed. And well done, Georgia. Well done for saying this isn't right. I mean, you know, sex is wonderful, fantastic, but incredibly private.
Yes,
and we want to be able to do whatever we want without finding out. I mean, she was having messages from America about it. I mean, just awful for her, and well done. And it's absolutely right. He goes to jail. This cannot go on.
Yeah, and he's got 21 months. Of course, he'll be out within barely a year.
Yeah, but it's still, jail is not pleasant. I mean, it is pretty horrible. It's pretty scary. He will learn a lot of lessons, and I hope that he will actually behave better. He put out a video of him and his current girlfriend sort of this morning. I mean, he obviously has no shame.
No. What is it about man's psyche that they do this?
I mean, I don't know. Was he trying to show off, or just be?
Was he trying to humiliate her? Show off that he was
show off his prowess?
Yes, yes, whatever.
I mean, it is, but it's like men sending pictures of their bits, and you think, God, no, this isn't why I want to go with you. I mean, they're very odd men.
And she looked very happy, didn't she, outside Chelmsford Crown Court?
She did.
And this would have been an ordeal. She'd have taken advice with her lawyers, her family and friends, whether to give up her anonymity. I suspect we'll see a big interview with her in one of the Sunday newspapers this weekend. I would imagine that tends to be what happens. And that's good too.
No, I think that's good, because I think what it says is, it says to everybody, I'm not ashamed. I did it, and this is what I do. And actually, more women should come forward and say this is what, because it's being used as blackmail. I mean, we know the police know it goes on far more than we realise, because the women are frightened to come forward.
Yeah, I mean, we had only this week, didn't we? Boris Johnson's wife talking out about the campaign to stop the release of the guy who battered his wife to death with a hammer in front of his children. She, of course, gave up her anonymity over the taxi car rapist, the serial rapist, John Walboys.
Yeah, I mean, and Carrie Johnson was really good to say that she was one of the people that this dreadful taxi driver who'd say, oh, I've just won the lottery, why don't you have a glass of champagne with me? And it was drugged, and then he'd rape them. And Carrie was one of the women who said, you know, this happened to me, he's got to stay in jail. She kept him in jail.
Yeah, and because if you remember, the parole board had recommended he be released.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Then, of course, dozens more cases came tonight. He is the most prolific serial rapist in the country, who should never, ever be allowed out of prison, ever, in my view, ever.
Oh, well, I think you can get.
Oh, you're going to be a bleeding heart liberal
well,
here,
maybe when he's 80.
No, why?
Anyway, I do think that he is really, really dangerous. And again, I mean, you know, he's never said how terrible what he did was. I mean, even if he was lying, you would think that he would be sensible enough to say, yes, what I did. And instead, he's just terrible. He's one of these ghastly men.
Still very important for women, though, that in these cases, anonymity is their right.
No, it is, because otherwise they won't go forwards. I mean, still, rape is a shaming thing.
Of course.
Right? And you don't want people, you know, I mean, in prison sometimes transcripts of rape trials are passed around because it titillates, because it's about sex. So actually, you do want to protect you want to protect all women, but then you want people like Harry Johnson and Georgia to come out and say, this is what happened to me.
All right, that's Scarlett McGuire. We're talking about that verdict in Chelmsford Crown Court, where Stephen Bear's been sentenced to 21 months in prison for sharing revenge porn of his ex-girlfriend, Georgia Harrison. What an appalling man he is. We're going to now go to Rhiannon, because we're going to go to the headlines a little after 1:30.
Thank you, Andrew. It's 1:34, your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Commons Privileges Committee says breaches of coronavirus rules in Downing Street would have been obvious to Boris Johnson at the time. The former Prime Minister is set to give evidence about Partygate and whether he lied to Parliament at the committee inquiry on March the 20th. Mr Johnson says it was his belief the rules and guidance had been followed and that there's no evidence he misled Parliament. Mr Johnson's also spoken out about the appointment of Sue Gray as Sir Keir Starmer's new Chief of Staff, calling it particularly concerning. The senior civil servant led an independent investigation into Partygate. It was announced yesterday she was leaving the civil service to join the Labour Party. Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg calling for a proper inquiry into the appointment, saying it invalidates her report into lockdown breaches at Number 10. The King and Queen Consort will make their first state visits to France and Germany at the end of the month. Buckingham Palace says the 6-day trip, beginning on the 26th of March, will celebrate Britain's relationship with both countries, marking shared histories, culture and values. The royal couple will travel to Paris and then onwards to Berlin. The trip will include a number of firsts, including the King being the first British monarch to give a speech from France's Senate chamber. And as we've been hearing, a reality TV star has been sentenced to 21 months in prison for sharing online a private video of him having sex with his ex-girlfriend. Stephen Bear was accused of circulating footage of him and Georgia Harrison having sex in his garden in August 2020. 28-year-old Miss Harrison, who's waived her right to anonymity, says she demanded the clip never be shared. Bear, who denies all charges, was found guilty of voyeurism as well as disclosing private films with intent to cause distress. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Andrew, back in just a moment.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Andrew Pierce back with you. As we've just been discussing, the reality TV star Stephen Bear, apparently he was in Big Brother, has been sentenced to 21 months in prison for sharing revenge porn of his ex-girlfriend Georgia Harrison on his OnlyFans website. Let's speak now to GB News South East England reporter Ray Addison, who's live for us outside Chelmsford Crown Court. Ray.
Yes, good afternoon, Andrew. Yes, Stephen Bear has been told he must serve 21 months in prison for voyeurism and 2 counts of disclosing private sexual films with intent to cause distress. He's been told as well that he'll be subject to a restraining order for 5 years in which he can never go and speak to or see his former girlfriend Georgia Harrison or even tweet about her or incite others to do the same. Now, as he arrived here earlier at Chelmsford Crown Court, he waved a peace sign and actually stopped to film a video with his girlfriend, his fiancée, Jessica Smith. He was given repeated opportunities to comment and apologise to his victim, but he denied that chance and said that he hopes that one day his side of the story gets out and he gets some justice. Now, appearing in court behind a screen, Ms. Harrison, who waived her right to anonymity during this trial, described it as a wicked crime, said it had always been her worst nightmare that a photo or video would surface of her, and talked about how she'd suffered extreme anxiety since this offence was committed back in 2020 by Stephen Bear. In fact, she revealed that she'd actually been hospitalised over Christmas because of the severity of this situation. She said everybody knew about this video. She couldn't go to the gym, to restaurants, so people in the street would come up to her as well. She said Stephen Bear had shown no empathy or sympathy, mocking her online during the trial itself, and had shown no regret for his actions. At the height of the video's fame, her Instagram page received 63 million page views as well. And as a result of this situation, she lost reality television work, her earnings dropped significantly, and her public image was irreparably damaged. Now, the judge, in summing up, said that he was satisfied that Stephen Bear had indeed lied to Ms. Harrison when he said that he deleted the video and had subsequently exploited the video due to its economic value and Ms. Harrison's fame as a reality television star. The mitigation from the defence lawyer for Mr. Bear was his psychiatric conditions. He's been diagnosed with ADHD. However, the judge said that that was no excuse for his actions and only a custodial sentence was appropriate.
All right, thanks for that. That's Ray Addison outside Chelmsford Crown Court. Scarlett, the good attempt by the lawyers to do some mitigation for him, but he's just a piece of work, isn't he?
Look,
a vile, horrible man.
ADHD is an attention deficit disorder. It doesn't actually mean that you have an excuse for being a complete and utter prat. I mean, he is just a terrible man.
And it's also, for her, she was very positive on the steps of the court, Georgia, but this must have been a pretty horrific experience for the last 2 years.
Oh, yeah. Well, when she says that, I mean, she obviously had a breakdown around Christmas. I mean, it just must have been so awful. And you think, wherever you go, people are going, yeah, I've seen you. But, I mean, she was wonderful. And the fact that he was tweeting throughout the trial, mocking her, I mean, you just think, what is this man? I mean, yeah, thank goodness he's going to jail.
Yeah, we've been talking today, of course, it's the second anniversary of the death, murder and rape of Sarah Everard, and 2 years already, terrible for the family. But again, it puts, women, how safe do women feel? Because you've not just got to contend with the fact you're going to come across a monster in a police uniform, but the internet now has become a very potent weapon against a lot of women.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, there's no question that... I mean, what happened to Sarah Everard is sort of everybody's nightmare, and you always say, it'll never happen. This isn't what happened. You don't get picked up on the street. I mean, I have said it to enough people, and then that happened. But actually, what's happening on the internet, I mean, where... You know, just because you're on Twitter, you can be abused. You can, I mean, people say just the most ghastly things, and they anonymously, of course, and they feel that they have a right to be absolutely disgraceful. And it's, I mean, the reason I do not look at my Twitter account is because, you know, even though I appear to be perfectly self-confident, I don't want to be attacked.
I get attacked all the time. I'm often told I've been attacked, but I couldn't give a hoot. Because I don't care what they say about me, and it doesn't bother me in the slightest. And I don't bother to read it either.
Right.
It's easy, and that's my advice to lots of people. If you're on Twitter, if you don't like it, don't be on Twitter, is the first thing to say. But if you are on Twitter, just don't read all the abuse.
Yeah.
Because I have been told some of the things they've said about me. Hilarious. People are obsessed, apparently, about my teeth. They are mine. They are my teeth. And no, I don't.
And they are those.
Yeah, and I don't have a dead black cat on my head either, which is apparently what people have been writing too. Well, joining me now are two GB voices, and they're very welcome. They're Miranda Richardson and John Reid. Hello to you both.
Hi, Andrew.
Good afternoon.
Good to talk to you. John, over to you. What do you want to talk about, John? What's getting your goat?
I tell you what, the subject you've just had is something that's very important to me. And if I could have 2 minutes of your time on that, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, do. Fire away.
Okay. So I don't know Stephen Bear from The Man in the Moon. I have no idea, nor the girl that he was seen with, nor anything else. However, I would raise the question, yeah, let's lock him up because he's been naughty. But if you lock him up for 21 months or 21 years, it will make no difference unless you rehabilitate the man in some way so that when he comes out, he's not the man he was when he went in. However, in the system we've got, in the criminal justice system we've got today, and I speak with some authority and knowledge on this, rehabilitation is taking a back seat. And I've got no idea how to rehabilitate somebody like him. But if we do nothing, he's just going to come out in whenever and do it all again because he's made that way. We need to rehabilitate. And we never get enough publicity on television or anywhere else from anyone that is sympathetic to doing something rather than just warehouse all these men up. You know, the population's increasing in prison. The prisons, new prisons are being built by the government as they see some kind of good thing in locking up even more people and costing us an absolute fortune into the bargain. But rehabilitation is limited in the extreme, and I'd like to do something about that.
John, before I bring in Miranda, you said you speak from experience in the system. What was your experience?
My experience is current, Andrew. I currently go into prison taking poetry, storytelling and that kind of thing into the men in the hope that they can bring a little bit of daylight into their miserable lives while they're in there. And the reason I do this is because mental health takes a terrible backseat whilst they're incarcerated. And while they're depressed and anxious and God knows what else, they won't listen to anybody. So in the first place, you have to get them listening. And that's what I do. So there are many, many viewers, I'm sure, and people in the population that will say, John, you're bonkers. What do you do that for? But I do it because I think it's a very worthwhile cause. I do it because I get paid for doing it and it tops up my pension. And I do it because I think it's very worthwhile. And I'd like to see more of it. I'd like to see more items on the TV, radio, wherever, to do something about this awful criminal justice system we've got, because it absolutely stinks.
Well, well done to you, John. I think that's a very good use of your time. Miranda, over to you. What would you want to talk about?
Hi, Andrew. Well, do you know, in my industry, it's quite funny because obviously I'm a publican, so I get a lot of males and females in my pub. And when you were talking earlier about what's a safe space and safe places for individuals when they come out, I think it's interesting that, you know, Stephen Bear, know him or if you don't know him or anything about him, the biggest issue we have is this culture of doesn't matter who you are, they're slightly untouchable, you know, and the whole reality TV individual, you know, turning up to court with the peace signs and the Twitter. And, you know, I've got people in here week in, week out that come into my pub that are in relationships, that those relationships break down, they fall out. They know that the backlash of sharing pictures of their girlfriends amongst themselves or their boyfriends amongst themselves, you know, these people who are, you know, normal, if you like, public, the general public, they understand how damaging that is. And I think it's very refreshing that he's ended up with a sentence, because it actually shows you're not untouchable. You can't behave like that. It's not acceptable. And it's quite good for the young individuals that come out that think, you know, just because your mate's been sent a picture of this bird or that bird, or the girls are sharing the latest lad they're going out with. It's really quite refreshing to be able to see that actually, you know, when I was younger, Andrew, you know, a couple of years ago, we didn't have that. You know, we didn't have this online presence all the time. We had a relationship. You had to. You didn't share instant pictures. You didn't share. They just want to share so much more information, and I think it's quite nice that we can rein it back a bit and go, do you know what, this is not on. Yeah. And when you have got safe spaces and places to be, you know, embrace that, because it, you know, it can be very murky, very murky.
Are either of you want? Yeah. I was going to say, are either of you on Twitter?
Yes,
Yes,
I am.
I am.
And do you get a lot of abuse?
No. I went viral last year for a gas bill tweet. I'm so rock and roll, that I was sharing in my last pub. And actually, a bit like you said earlier, when you put it out there, I'm on Twitter because I want to be on Twitter. For me, it's a little bit of a safe space in my industry, more so than kind of any of the other socials, because other publicans understand me. I don't. If somebody, they don't know me, if they want to put a comment, that's fine. They don't know me.
All right,
that's okay.
All right. Well, listen, lovely to talk to you both. That's Miranda Richardson and John Reid, two of our GB News voices. Now, we've been discussing the latest lockdown files in the Telegraph today. Further leaked WhatsApp messages from Matt Hancock suggests his team asked if they could lock up, how dare they, our very own Nigel Farage for being, quote, a pub hooligan and breaking lockdown rules. I'm delighted to say Nigel joins me now. Nigel, how would you have coped in prison, do you think?
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Not only did that pipsqueak, Matt Hancock, who was given the powers of a medieval king with the Coronavirus Act, clearly decide that maybe Mr. Farage should be singled out, but have been a member of his staff. Shall we lock Farage up? Shall we put him in prison? Shall we get onto the Home Office and try and make this happen? And don't forget, Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, writing to the police. Now look, I had been back from America for 14 days. But whether the day I landed counted as a free day, I don't know. So maybe I'd been back for 13 nights and 12 hours. But either way, I'd been back for a fortnight. I'd had a test. I was negative. And it just goes to show how absolutely crazy not only was lockdown and coronavirus rules, but the way in which the British state used and abused the police force and everybody else to try and make us live under a reign of terror. So you know what? If I'm in breach because I went down the pub on the days the pubs reopen, you want to find me, you want to come and get me, you can. But I've got a bigger confession. As those months went on, we went into successive lockdowns. I just started ignoring the rules. I thought they were absolutely ludicrous, and I'm amazed that not more fellow Britons did. Or maybe they did. I wonder who, watching this or listening to this, didn't go and visit a relative, didn't meet a friend in the garden. The whole thing was crazy, and I have to say, all of this should have come out in a public inquiry already. The fact that it hasn't, and it's had to be leaked, well, if that's how we find out, Andrew, that's how we find out. We were led through all of this by people who were incompetent, people with no experience, and people for whom power literally went to their head.
And in those latest revelations in the Telegraph today, Nigel, there is a lot about ministers saying we've got to effectively weaponise the police against people like you who may have broken the rules.
Yeah, I mean, disgusting. I can tell you the police knocked on my door 3 times during that period, but I also had, when I'd been abroad and done stuff, repeatedly people knocking on the door, checking I was there. I mean, can you imagine the sheer waste of money of all of this? But I'm worried about this because we always think in the UK that we, our liberties, our freedoms, we take them for granted. We look at Europe that went fascist, that went communist. We think it could never ever happen to us. What we saw during lockdown was government using taxpayers' money to terrify us with adverts, to use all the weapons of the state, including the police force, to try and lock us down, to encourage neighbours to report on each other. We literally lost our liberties and freedoms, and it could happen again. And we've got to make sure this never, ever, ever happens. We need a full public debate, but we also need accountability from those that did this to us.
All right, Nigel. That's Nigel Farage, our very own GB News presenter, and of course he'll be with us, of course, back in his usual slot next week. Now, the other day, it was yesterday, in fact, the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson suggested he may not be able to vote for Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. It's called the Windsor, what's it called? The Windsor Framework. He said it's not about, quotes, the UK taking back control. That would be a serious blow for Rishi Sunak. He also talked about tax and other issues, but talking about Joining me now is Gina Miller. She's the leader of the True and Fair Party and, of course, was a leading voice on the Remain side in the referendum. Gina, if I could ask you first of all about Partygate. We now know Boris Johnson is to be before that Privileges Committee in the week beginning March the 20th. It's going to be chaired by Harriet Harman. They've released a 30-page report today which suggests pretty much that there was pretty overwhelming evidence that Boris knew that rules were being broken in number 10.
I'm amazed it's taken them this long. It was obvious. I mean, you can't have that level of noise and people going in and out and not knowing. I just think it's terrible how long it's taken, actually, for this inquiry to get to this stage. But I actually agree with Mr. Farage, who's just been on to your show, to say it has to be about accountability. It has to be about how can it be one rule for them and one rule for everybody else. If you think how many people weren't allowed to say goodbye or didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye to loved ones or to go and see friends who were suffering from all sorts of mental health and other issues, I do think it's deplorable that they were flouting the rules and bringing in, we know from the WhatsApp lockdown files now, a very serious issue, which is that decisions were being made that were not based on medical advice or expert advice. This was about politics. It's absolutely shameful.
Gina, Boris also said in his speech the other day that he will find it difficult to vote for Sunak's Brexit deal. He said it isn't really Brexit. We know the European Court of Justice will still be the ultimate arbiters of any trade dispute in Northern Ireland. What is your impression of what Rishi Sunak has negotiated with the EU?
What Rishi has done is use the tools that already exist in the withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement, which were placed there so we could renegotiate if things weren't working well. And we saw with Northern Ireland that things were not working well. The peace is now under threat with what has happened with the bombing recently, and then we've also got John Caldwell, tragic situation. So what's happening is that Rishi Sunak is now using political capital to use the mechanisms that are already in those international treaties. The political will wasn't there. The politicizing of everything and the language that Boris Johnson was using was not conducive for both sides sitting down. And I think that's what we're seeing now, is a different mood and mood music in both Brussels and the UK, because we can only move forward if both sides are willing to do so in a good faith manner.
All right, that's Gina Miller, who's the leader of the True and Fair Party. Scarlett McGuire, I've only got about a minute left. On that Brexit deal, I know you were an arch Remainer. I was a Brexiteer. Do you think that the Commons should embrace it and approve it?
Yeah, I think this is as good as we're going to get. Right. And I think it's really, really important that the people of Northern Ireland, that they can have pets taken over, they can eat English sausages, all of that. I mean, the shame is, of course, as a Remainer, that the deal is not as good as we had before we left.
All right, well, I disagree fundamentally with that, of course. That's Scarlett McGuire. You've been watching and listening to Andrew Pearce here on GB News. Up next, it's the briefing with the quite truly magnificent Arlene Foster.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of